This book is called Phoenix, and I'm not going to tell you anything about it. It starts with us straight in with the main character, Phoenix. And yes, I'm going to be putting on voices throughout this, so for now, just relax, chill, and enjoy this part of the stream. Anil's tiny lungs laboured as he breathed, sitting tucked by the fire to keep the chill from the late summer night from making him cough. His bright orange feathers and hair matched the hues of the flame as he pulled his wings tight around his shoulders to maintain the warmth the fire was radiating. Autumn was right around the corner, the cool winds from the surrounding desert blowing strong after sundown this time of year. Turning the last page of his book, the young Phoenix already wanted to read more, longing for just one more chapter. He sighed, knowing it meant he'd have to leave his secure little nook to retrieve something else to read. With his chronic respiratory problems, it was always difficult for him to get around, so he had gotten used to staying in one place as much as possible. Carefully pulling the blanket around himself, making sure it didn't reach the fire, he got to his feet. Immediately, the cold of the floor sank into his feet. The book he'd been reading was nearly half the size of his torso. Correction. The book he'd been reading was nearly the size of his torso, making it difficult to carry, but with some effort he managed. Cradling it in his arms, he weakly made his way out of his room and down the hallway, vacant and dimly lit by the periodic torch. The chill hit him almost as soon as he left the fireside, feeling his tiny body losing its heat quickly, even as he clung to the blanket like a lifeline. The icy marble floor didn't help with that either. He could feel his lungs start to wheeze slightly as he made his way, the effort and the cool air combining to make the small trip to the library a mountainous task. By the time he reached the door, he was shaking, struggling to push the heavy wood open. Grunting, he put the little bit of weight he had into, opened it, and managed to gain access to the massive room. This room was only lit by moonlight, a cold light that would be difficult to navigate by if he didn't know the room well. His father's book collection was immense, and the library was possibly one of the largest rooms in their palace and was central in the building. The young Phoenix Prince had read and reread most of them in the time that he'd lived in Valakana, having been housebound his entire life. He knew he wouldn't make it in the world if he tried to leave, so he didn't fight for his father's wishes to stay in the palace. He was plenty helpful where he was anyway. He was well read and was good at helping his father make decisions to aid their kingdom, having studied every piece of information related to their homeland. He knew the roads, aqueducts, and sewage systems throughout their modest kingdom, and had made many good adjustments, even without having made it out there himself. It was certainly a challenge, but he'd been doing his best to be useful despite his ailment. Sometimes the people around him forgot how old he was, because of his childlike appearance, but he'd been living like this for over 70 years. He picked up a few tricks to work through it within that time, even if his family didn't let him help with most things. His teeth began to chatter as he caught himself thinking too much, and he tried to quicken his pace a bit. Knowing he was in no shape to take any steps or ladders, he left the massive tome he was carrying on the table and picked out something from the ground level. He was most familiar with these books for this reason, and knew next time he felt up to it, he'd have to bring some others down from higher shelves to add to his queue. He was most in the mood to learn something new, but he knew he couldn't retrieve something like that tonight, instead pulling out an adventurous story to keep his interest. It was amazing how a good tale could be read countless times and never lose its excitement. His heart longed to explore the world like the characters of these stories, but it was a far reach even for someone with a normal body. For him, it was simply impossible. He accepted this knowledge with years of redundancy, having reinforced repeatedly why he couldn't leave. It was something that made books all the more alluring in their ability to share information from any location. His mind loved going on imaginary journeys, letting the words build the world in his head, one beyond these walls. Looking over the spines of the books, he could vaguely make out the titles and carefully selected one. The book he pulled was thankfully smaller than the last, making it easier to take back to his room. Tucking it under one arm, he used the other to pull the blanket up around his neck tighter, and burrowed his face in as well to use the warm air to protect his lungs. He could barely breathe right now, but he'd be fine if he made it back to the fire. Unsteady on his feet, he started back towards his room. It wasn't far, but his body was shaking furiously now, making it difficult to move as he wanted. Determinedly struggling, he forced himself forwards, regretting it for a moment as he nearly fell. "Anil," called a woman's voice from nearby, catching his attention. It was Sharon, one of the guards. "Why aren't you in your room?" The concern in her voice was an immediate reminder that her care was more than just duty, the worry in her eyes clear in the torchlight. "I just needed a new book," he chittered out. She rushed over, seeing how cold he was, and scooped him into her arms. He wrapped his arms and legs around her as she carried his weight easily, though he wasn't much of a feat for her to lift. Her body felt hot against his cold skin, and he nestled in like a baby bird. The griffin's mane was fluffy and warm, and the phoenix was eager to burrow his face into the fur, letting the heat of the air within help his lungs recover from the chill from the night. "You should have called for help. It's too cold out. You need to be more careful." "I know," he said, muffled as he refused to leave the warm fur. She laughed softly, hugging him tighter. She was the closest thing to a mother he had left, and he was grateful she was here for him. "You know, it's late as well. You could have just gone to bed," she prompted. "It's not that late. I'm not even tired yet," he complained. "If you lay down, I'm sure you'll find yourself tired before you know it. I'll stay with you for a while and make sure you're settled in." When they entered his chambers, the heat from the fire reached them, radiating and sinking into the phoenix's chilled body, even through the blanket. He wanted to curl up near it again, but Sharon walked past it, pulling back the thick covers of his bed and lowering him into the plush material. All the bedding was warm, and the little prince couldn't help give a contented coo as the heat and softness immediately comforted him. He could almost laugh at himself for being so easily manipulated, but he knew it was all through love and care. "That's better, isn't it?" He nodded, meeting her smile with his own. "All right, I'll admit going to bed is a good idea." Willingly giving his guardian the book, he watched her delicately put it on his bedside table. It always amazed him how gentle she could be despite her size and defined muscles. She had spent as much time honing her careful restraint as her combat abilities. He considered her a very well-rounded warrior. "I'll stay with you until you're warm enough for me to put the fire out, all right?" "You don't have to. I can put it out." "I don't want you getting out of bed again," she countered sternly. "You need to stay put and keep yourself well. If you disregard your health, you'll be bedridden again, and winter will be here before you know it." He sighed, knowing she was right. "It wasn't that bad, but I'll make sure to take more care," he assured. He didn't really think this incident was a big deal, but it was enough to remind him of the past. He hasn't always made it through the winter without dying and rekindling. I will be careful," he said again, more serious. He didn't want to develop pneumonia this year. "Good boy," she said, forgetting he was older than her again. She pulled the covers up a bit to tuck them in around his chin, making him smile again at her sweet, motherly behavior. He loved her just as much as she loved him. These moments always confirmed it. He watched as she walked across the room, easily lifting one of his reading chairs and bringing it close to the bed so she could sit with him. "If I can't stay up to read, will you tell me a story?" "Only if it will help you sleep." "It will. My mind is too awake otherwise," he assured, getting a raised brow for it, but she relented anyway. "Oh, all right. I suppose I can think of something." Crossing her legs, she sat back and thought, clearly trying to think of something she hadn't told him before. It would be a difficult challenge, since he asked for stories quite often, and he knew he could spare her with a request. "Tell me again about how you and Fleet met." She gave a soft chuckle in return. "That one again. You must know it forward and back by now." A familiar story is... Oh my goodness. "A familiar story is best to fall asleep to," he assured her. He heard her soft sigh, knowing it was all in good humour. As much as she pretended to be tired of telling the story, it was as much of a favourite for her as it was for Anil. He knew how much she enjoyed recalling anything involving her lover, so asking for a story relating to him was sure to put a smile on her face. Sure enough, within moments of thinking back on it, she was glowing with her affection for the centaur. I was surviving on my own in the wild west of Magnelia, having nowhere to go after my mother abandoned me. No one was crazy enough to take in a chimera like myself, and I didn't know where to turn. He could picture the scene now, the thick trees and greenery he'd read about. He'd seen pictures of what a forest would look like and could imagine Sharon fitting into it well. Her physical attributes were built for the terrain, though he knew from previous tales that she hadn't taken advantage of her strength, still green at the time. I could hunt, but shelter was scarce, she said dramatically, like she was reliving the direness of the situation. Even now I can't build a passable shelter. It's beyond me. Her hearty laugh followed melodically. I thought I'd die a fool who couldn't build herself a home. I was desperate enough that I thought maybe I could try to evict a bear family from a nearby cave and take shelter there. But Fleet passed by at the perfect time. He happened to be escorting your father's carriage to Magnelia when he heard me fighting with the bears. The other guards were focused on making sure Martel wasn't in danger, but Fleet was the first to investigate. I was a bloody mess, half mauled when he came sprinting through the trees like an angel to my side. Just his size was enough to give the bears pause, and he didn't hesitate to sweep me off my feet and get me to safety. He didn't even have to fight them. He was too fast for them to even think about chasing us. That's the first time I've ever felt like I was flying without using my wings. He makes me feel even lighter than when I'm flying. She paused to bask in her memory, her longing expression captivating. Anil was already relaxing into the soothing sound of her voice as she recounted the story. He brought me back to the group, worrying over my injuries like no one had ever before. I can't understand how anyone could care for a creature like me, a cursed hybrid with no family. Anil's heart ached for her. He couldn't imagine how anyone could reject another person simply because they were a mixed species, but it was common outside of their city. When I asked him why he was helping me, he didn't understand why I was asking. Of course he would help. That's the man he is, but he also wasn't used to the cruelties outside of Valocana, being a native here. It took your father explaining the mindset of other cities for Fleet to understand what I'd been through. I thought once he knew, he'd stop helping me, but he wouldn't let me leave his side after that. She gave a little chuckle that brought the smile back to Anil's face. He was so worried about me that the king let him leave the group to escort me back here. Valocana sounded like a dream when he talked about it, but I was still so nervous to meet the people. I was expecting to be driven off like I'd been from my own town, but instead I found others like myself. It's been a refuge from the hatred of other places, and I'm still grateful he brought me here. Fleet watched over me until I had recovered and got me on my feet here. It seems silly now, knowing we could have spared ourselves the trouble of getting me on my own place if I had known we were going to end up together not even a year later. Anil's eyelids were growing heavy, his mind already picturing what it was like to be out in the wilds. His imagination was powerful and made falling asleep easy, with how quickly he could form the thought foundation for a pleasant dream. The soft padding of his bed helped with that, and Sharon could see him starting to nod off. She let her story trail off, moving the chair back quietly and putting out the fire to be safe. Good night, little bird. Sweet dreams. The words settled into his sleepy mind, making him feel secure as he drifted off. It was late in the morning when he was awakened by a rapping at his door, his body having needed the ample rest. He would have normally woken earlier, but he'd pushed himself too hard and needed to recover. Weakly pushing himself up to sit up, he rubbed the sleep from his eyes and called out to the person on the other side of the door. "Come in." One of the guards opened his door, ushering in his doctor, here for a regular checkup. Anil was familiar with the man, and while Anil stayed childlike, Dr. Tarak had grown old. The Strix's familiar features were wreathed in wrinkles, and it had accumulated over the decades. his grey feathers having turned pale over time. The thought of losing him was one that the young phoenix kept buried in the back of his mind, not wanting to think about it. He couldn't stand the thought, but it was the fate of those that weren't of his bloodline. It was a irrefutable fact, and he couldn't fight it, though he found himself often trying.
"You seem to be in good spirits today, Anil. Are you feeling well?"
His wizened smile met the prince, easing his worries.
"I haven't started my day yet, so it's full of possibilities," he replied. "I did have a bad night, though. I shouldn't have left the fireside, but I did. I had some coughing fits and weakness in my legs. I feel better after resting, though. By the looks of the light, I must have slept at least 10 hours.
"It sounds like you're starting the colder months off with a bang,"
he joked lightheartedly.
Up late reading, I'm sure.
Anil avoided his gaze at that, earning a chuckle in response. They both knew nights in this desert home of theirs were cold as they approached fall, and the doctor didn't feel the need to remind him.
"I'm sure you'll be more careful as the weather changes. I do have something that might help, though. There's some new medicine we can try."
Anil was tired of the medicines, but sometimes they helped, so he kept taking them. It was the least he could do to ease the worry of those around him, and he hadn't passed from his ailment for the last decade or so, since they found that some were more effective.
What kind of medicine? What kind of medicine?"
"It's a mixture from the land of giants. They've only just recently allowed others to access some of their resources."
Anil perked up hearing that.
"The giants? I heard something about a boom in the trading business, but I didn't know it was something as big as that," he said in wonder. "They've never been interested in trading with others before. What's changed?"
His excitement was visible, the doctor's wrinkles deepening with his smile as he saw it in the phoenix.
"I can't say. They're still keeping to themselves mostly, so there's no word on why they've changed their ways. They aren't trading in large amounts, so the demand for anything from them is incredibly high."
"I'm sure. This is a monumental moment in history."
His mind was racing with the possibilities of causes for this change, his excitement picking up his spirits immediately. He suddenly had the bounding energy that matched his youthful appearance.
"They say this medicine is exceptional for treating people with weak constitutions. It will be difficult to keep a regular stock, but I'd like to prescribe you this for the time being. Take it once a day in the morning, and let me know how it affects your day-to-day life."
Anil nodded, excitedly, eager to try the mystery medicine. He tried to restrain his elation as the doctor slowly walked closer, pulling his satchel off his shoulder and methodically opening it to pull out the package. Pulling the string that held it closed, he opened the fabric to reveal many tiny packages in similar form.
"Each one of these is a dose,"
he informed, taking one in his large wrinkled fingers and dropping it into the young phoenix's waiting palm. He opened it carefully, revealing a dark green paste that smelled earthy and rich. It was a pungent smell, but not entirely unpleasant. It wasn't something that sparked appetite in him, but he didn't think he would mind taking it, judging by the scent. Hoping the smell wasn't fooling him, he put the paste into his mouth, brows raising in surprise. It was milky, floral, and almost minty all at the same time. Some of the earthiness was in the taste, but the scent hadn't fully prepared him for the flavour of it, and he swallowed with an audible gulp that earned a laugh from his doctor.
"Does it taste that bad?"
"It's not too bad. I just wasn't expecting it to taste the way it does. I wonder what goes into it,"
he said curiously. He was sure it was a plant-based medicine, but there was no way for him to know unless he went to the land of the giants, and that wasn't going to happen. His mind burned with curiosity, but he knew there was no way for him to meet this need of knowledge on his own. It was hard as a phoenix to deny his urge to pursue information, but he was logical enough to understand his limitations.
"Well, I hope to find you in better health in the near future,"
the doctor started,
clearly preparing to leave. "Keep on your medicine, and we'll see how it's treating you in a week's time. And no careless exposure to cold air, young man," he chastised, though he was obviously just giving the phoenix a hard time.
"I'll be careful, I promise,"
he said, as the doctor slowly made his way out of the room, and Neil collected the medicine into the pouch again, carefully tucking the substance away in his bedside table like a treasure. When he looked up again, he was alone. Clambering out of the mass of blankets, he removed his sleeping garment and prepared for the day. His preferred clothing was a flowy and loose, a common style in his kingdom, though he wasn't particularly concerned with following trends. It just happened to be so that his preferences aligned with the style, but he was sure the commonality of it was more due to the climate of their homeland. He pulled out an outfit that consisted of draping fabrics and decorative sashes, accentuating the design with the armband and the usek he favored. The neckpiece covered his throat and the collarbones, going down into a point on his chest, and was covered in beads and jewels, an object of royalty. The armband, as well, was a representation of his family lineage, and had 3 metal extensions that spiraled to wrap around a gemstone. It was far simpler than the neckpiece, but it meant more to him, tying him to his family in a way. His thin frame was extremely delicate under the outfit, the fabric flowing and looking light where the metal had something of a heavy look. It actually helped support his neck and gave him some weight to stay on his feet, and he was so light anything more than a gentle breeze could knock him over. He didn't have the chance to get out often, but he needed sunlight to help his health. Most warmer days he would get to go out and enjoy the courtyards, but windy days proved to be challenging for him. Between his wings, hollow bones, and frail body, he only weighed around 50 pounds, and had little muscle to speak of, which made it even simple tasks difficult. Once he'd laced his shoes, he opened the door, testing the air before venturing out. He was happy to find the warm day he was hoping for, stepping out into the humid heat. He had several hours of daylight that would keep the air warm, but he knew he'd have to be back inside before sunset, when the temperature would plummet. He hadn't been summoned for counsel with his father today, not that it happened very often. His father liked to include Anil in some matters of governing, mostly geographical things that interested him. He'd helped develop the aqueducts that ran through the city, and made it the oasis that it was. The young phoenix had heard the lush plant life described, the greenery that had filled the city quickly after the additions, bringing the growth that was near the river and extending it through the different districts. It made their home a popular spot for visitors in this region, and a frequent stop for travellers. Most of the other kingdoms within the desert lands were built into cliffsides or in underground homes to protect themselves from the land, but his people adapted the land and had a choice location next to the largest river in Ilok. So excited about that. He did enjoy studying maps and learning about these other cities and the lands far beyond his reach. Studying with passion gave him the fuel he needed to be quite useful in aiding his father, even if his father tried to shelter him from most duties he'd normally be expected to take on. With his health, they had a tendency to baby him, and even when he tried to see if he could help with other matters, they'd encourage him to care for others first and forget about politics. That said, he understood a great deal of political standings. Primarily, he learned a lot of social etiquette in different regions and of laws in cultural norms. He found the differences between them fascinating and was sure that these differences were the root of many problems between each of the societies. He was not kept abreast of news of wars or squabbles, but he at least knew his history and had something of an idea of who got along with who. Thinking about such things had him yearning to read more, but he knew he should try to spend some time outside whilst it was warm out. He'd get Sharon to help him gather a collection of reading material for later when he'd have to stay inside by the fire. He knew it was only a matter of time before he wouldn't be able to spend any time outside, and he'd lose his chance to take in the sun and opportunities to try to exercise. He didn't quite have the full energy of a child, but he still had the exuberance and desire to play. Wishing it didn't take so much out of him, he knew he'd have to temper his fun with careful monitoring of his well-being. Making his way into the inner court, he hoped to run into a potential playmate, but was not so lucky. If no one was in his wing of the palace, it meant they were busy and didn't have time to play or chaperone, which he was used to.
He did love the days when he had others to spend time with, though. Regardless, he made his way into the garden, overflowing with flowers that scented the air. Taking a deep breath, he took it all in as he sat on his swing and worked his legs back and forth to sway. It was a gentle way to get exercise, and it gave him time to ruminate. With winter around the corner, he had a lot to think about. He hoped his medicine would help, and immediately his curiosities about the land of giants rose to the front of his thoughts again. The giants were a solitary community, and lived high in the mountains separating almost all of the continent from the Forbidden North. Only the dragons lived in the Forbidden North, and no one dared go into their land. The dragons were one of the few races Anil knew of that had no allies and had no need for them. As far as the rest of the world was concerned, the dragons and giants could do what they wanted in their respective territories and prayed that they wouldn't venture out of their homelands. He found the giants particularly interesting. The drakes were feared primarily for their strength and territorial disputes. If you wandered too close to a dragon, it wouldn't be long before your things were their things, or so the saying went. The giants, however, were a mystery. The most information he knew about them was that they'd never fallen in battle, and were left alone because the other cities had learned not to bother them. They were also one of the only people able to stand against the dragons without fear, which was respectable in its own right. No one wanted to bother the giants, thus information on them was difficult to find. He hoped their new decision to trade was out of desire to grow, and not out of necessity for resources, but it could really go either way. He was grateful for the change, though, excited about his new medicine. He had to wonder how old the recipe was. Perhaps it was an ancient remedy handed down through their people, or perhaps it was newly discovered and was the reason they were starting to trade. There were so many possibilities. His mind was running through them with exuberance. He hoped someone would take the opportunity to learn more about their people and write a book on it. The young phoenix would give anything to read more about them. He was fairly certain that people would have an affinity for earth abilities, though he knew there was plenty of room for him to be mistaken. There was a strong chance they'd held traits in ice as well, since they lived in the cold high in the mountains. He couldn't imagine living in a place where it snowed 80% of the year. He'd only seen snow twice in his life, and the first time it had killed him. The second time he was more careful, but it still came down with something nasty afterwards. It was difficult being in the position of knowing snow is frozen water, but being too transfixed by its beauty and mystery to care if it was bad for him. Snow was so exceptionally rare, particularly because precipitation was scarce, so he couldn't deny himself the experience of snow. It was one of the few times he disobeyed his father as well. The older phoenix had been upset with him, but when he explained himself, the king couldn't be mad at Anil for it. The recovery time after was enough punishment for him anyway. It was one of the rare times he was happy his father doted on him so heavily.
"I suppose your father was worried for nothing," said a voice, interrupting his thoughts. He recognized the male voice, turning to see Sabala approaching. He moved his strong build with fluid elegance, his prideful grace carrying in each step, but his warm personality showed with his smile. He was a Tyrellian. They carried himself with power, but conducted himself with a kind of integrity. It was an award-winning combination that won over everyone who crossed his path.
Why was my father worrying this time?
"He told me to check on you, because he heard word that you fell ill last night. I know not the origin of the information, but I'm happy to see you well."
The winged lion sat down on the nearby bench, looking like he was getting settled in for a while. The thought that he wanted to spend time with the young phoenix warmed the prince's heart. He was grateful to have such good people in his life.
Must have been Sharon that told him. I went to the library last night to trade out my books, and almost didn't make it back to my room. She was, thankfully, nearby and helped me back to bed.
He could see Sabala starting to take a breath, probably to give him the same warning everyone else had.
The warm air in my room was enough to settle my coughing, and I'll be more careful going forward,
he hurried to say before he could be scolded again.
I hadn't realized it was getting that cold out yet, but now I know. After sunset, I'll be in my room studying. I just have to make sure I have enough reading material to keep me occupied after dark.
Sabala gave Anil a raised eyebrow, but didn't say anything more on the topic. eventually breaking into a smile.
I heard you started a new medicine today as well. Dr. Tarek mentioned it on his way out.
Anil knew his father must have sent Sabala, knowing if the doctor had seen him that he'd be up. The young phoenix rested so frequently it was hard to know when you might find him sleeping. Luckily, his family knew his body's limits and gave him what he needed to take care of his body's deficiencies. Sometimes it was time and space. Sometimes it was medicine. Sometimes it was books. Today it was company and checking in on him. He was glad for it and was eager to share his exciting news.
"He told me the medicine is from the land of the giants," he informed proudly. "Can you imagine that? They've started trading for the first time, and I'm one of the lucky few to experience some of their medicine."
Sabala smiled at that, raising his brows in clear surprise that told Anil that the doctor hadn't shared that tidbit.
Medicine from the giants?
He mused in awe for a moment before speaking again in a humorous tone.
Maybe it's the secret to their size, and you'll grow a foot in a month's time,
he said, jokingly encouragingly.
With the medicine, I'm sure you'll be as hardy as the giants at the very least.
"I hope so. There's more that I could dream to gain, but it would be amazing to see," he admitted. "What I really want is to learn more about the giants. Do you know if there are any books or texts on them in their history?
Sabala's smile waned, and he knew the answer wasn't favorable.
I don't know any of that, but...
He turned his smile back on encouragingly.
I'll see what I can find.
The lion always knew what to say to make Anil feel better, even if he knew somewhere in the back of his mind that his friend was probably just humoring him.
I'm sure where they're starting to trade there will be more information spreading. Surely the change will create a spark of interest in people, and information will travel as it does.
Anil smiled, nodding his agreement.
"That's exactly what I was thinking,"
the young phoenix said brightly.
I'll send word and begin my search immediately. If your father allows, I will even travel in search of this information for you. I'm sure he'd be interested in adding the knowledge to his collection as well. Even if it's not written, I will find what information I can."
"Thank you," Anil said, getting up and hugging the other appreciatively.
"I'll eagerly await word from you."
"It's my pleasure."
He stood after they ended the hug, going to request leave from King Martel. Anil was again alone, but he was hopeful. He wondered what they might discover in their search for information on the giants. Sitting back down on his swing, he felt the warmth of the sun radiate through his chest as joy filled him. It was good to have those that loved him in his life.